The Red Pyramid, Chapter 2, An Explosion for Christmas. I'd been to the British Museum before. In fact, I've been in more museums than I like to admit. It makes me sound like a total geek. Sadie's in the background yelling that I am a total geek. Thanks, sis. Anyway, the museum was closed and completely dark, but the curator and 2 security guards were waiting for us on the front steps. Dr. Kane, the curator, was a greasy little dude in a cheap suit. I'd seen mummies before with more hair and better teeth. Whew. He shook my dad's hand like he was meeting a rock star. Your last paper on Imhotep. Brilliant. I don't know how you translated those spells. Emo what? Sadie muttered to me. Imhotep, I said. High priest architect. Some say he was a magician. Designed the first step pyramid, you know? I don't know, Sadie said. Don't care either. Ouch. Dad expressed his gratitude to the curator for hosting us on a holiday. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. Dr. Martin, I'd like you to meet Carter and Sadie. Ah, your son, obviously. And the curator looked hesitantly at Sadie. And who's this young lady? That's my daughter, Dad said. Dr. Martin's stare went temporarily blank. Doesn't matter how open-minded or polite people think they are, there's always that moment of confusion that flashes across their face when they realize Sadie is part of our family. I hate it, but over the years I've come to expect it. The curator regained his smile. Yes, of course. Right this way. Dr. Kane, we're very honored. The security guards locked the doors behind us. They took our luggage, then one of them reached for Dad's work bag. No, Dad said with a tight smile. I'll keep this with me. The guards stayed in the foyer as we followed the curator into the great court. It was an ominous night. Dim light from the glass-domed ceiling cast cross-hatched shadows across the walls like a giant spider web. Our footsteps clicked on the white marble floor. So, Dad said, the stone. Yes, the curator said, though I can't imagine what new information could glean from it. It's been studied to death. Our most famous artifact, of course. Of course, Dad said. But you may be surprised. What's he on about now? Sadie whispered to me. I didn't answer. I had a sneaking suspicion what stone they were talking about, and I couldn't figure out why Dad would drag us out on Christmas Eve to see it. I wondered what he'd been about to tell us at Cleopatra's Needle. Something about our mother and the night she died. And why did he keep glancing around as if he expected to see those strange people pop up again? We were locked in a museum, surrounded by guards and high-tech security. Nobody could bother us here. Well, I hoped. We turned left into the Egyptian wing. The walls were lined with massive statues of pharaohs and gods, but my dad bypassed them all and went straight to the main attraction in the middle of the room. Beautiful, my father murmured. And it's not a replica? No, the curator promised. We don't always keep the actual stone on display, but for you, this is the real one. We were staring at a slab of dark gray rock, about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It sat on a pedestal, encased in a glass box. The flat surface of the stone was chiseled with 3 distinct bands of writing. The top part was ancient Egyptian picture writing, hieroglyphics. The middle part, I had to rack my brain to remember what Dad called it. Demotic? A kind of writing from the period when the Greeks controlled Egypt, and a lot of Greek words got mixed into Egyptian. The last lines were pure Greek. The Rosetta Stone, I said. Isn't that a computer program? Sadie asked. I wanted to tell her how stupid she was, but the curator cut me off with a nervous laugh. Young lady, the Rosetta Stone was the key to deciphering hieroglyphics. It was discovered by Napoleon's army in 1799 and... All right, Sadie said. Yeah, I remember now. I knew she was just saying that to shut him up, but my dad wouldn't let it go. Sadie, he said, until this stone was discovered, regular mortals, no one had been able to read hieroglyphics for centuries. The written language of Egypt had been completely forgotten. Then an Englishman named Thomas Young proved that the Rosetta Stone's 3 languages all conveyed the same message. A Frenchman named Champollion took up the work and cracked the code of hieroglyphics. Sadie chewed her gum unimpressed. Then what's it say? Dad shrugged. Nothing important. It's basically a thank you letter from some priest to King Ptolemy V. When it was first carved, the stone was no big deal, but over the centuries, it has become a powerful symbol. Perhaps most important connection between ancient Egypt and the modern world. I was a fool not to realize its potential sooner. He'd lost me, and apparently the curator was completely lost too. Dr. Kane? The curator asked. Are you okay? Dad breathed deeply. My apologies, Dr. Martin. I was just thinking aloud. If I could have the glass removed, and if you could bring me the papers I asked for from your archives. Dr. Martin nodded. He pressed a code into a small remote control, and the front of the glass box clicked open. It'll take a few minutes to retrieve the notes, Dr. Martin said. For anyone else, I would hesitate to grant unguarded access to the stone. As you've requested, I trust you'll be careful. He glanced at us kids like we were troublemakers, but Dad said, Oh, we'll be careful. As soon as Dr. Martin's steps receded, Dad turned us with a frantic look in his eyes. Children, this is very important. You have to stay out of this room. He slipped his work bag off his shoulder and unzipped it, just enough to pull out a bike chain and padlock. Follow Dr. Martin. You'll find his office at the end of the great court on the left. There's one entrance. Once he's inside, wrap this around the door handle and lock it tight. We need to delay him. You want us to lock him in? Sadie asked, very interested. Okay. Dad, I said, what's going on? I don't have time to explain, he said. This will be our only chance, and they're coming. Who? Asked Sadie. He took Sadie by the shoulders. Sweetheart, I love you, he said. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for so many things, but there's no time. If this works, I promise I'll make everything better for everyone. Carter, you are my brave man. You have to trust me. Lock up Dr. Martin, and then stay out of this room. Chaining the curator's door was easy, but as soon as we'd finished, we looked back the way we'd come and saw a blue light streaming from the Egyptian gallery, as if our dad had installed some sort of glowing aquarium. Sadie locked eyes with me. Honestly, do you have any idea what he's doing? None, I said, but he's acting very strange lately, thinking a lot about Mom. He keeps her picture. I didn't want to say more. Fortunately, Sadie nodded, and she understood. What's in his work bag? She asked. I don't even know. He's never even told me, and tells me to not look in it. Sadie raised an eyebrow. And you never did? God, that is so like you, Carter. You're hopeless. I wanted to defend myself, but just then, a tremor shook the floor. Startled, Sadie grabbed my arm. He told us to stay put, and I suppose you're going to follow that order too? Actually, that order was sounding pretty good to me, but Sadie sprinted down the hall, and after a moment's hesitation, I ran right after her. When we reached the entrance of the Egyptian gallery, we stopped dead in our tracks. Our dad stood in front of the Rosetta Stone with his back to us. A blue circle glowed on the floor around him as if someone had switched on a hidden neon tube in the floor. My dad threw off his overcoat. His work bag lay open at his feet, revealing a wooden box about 2 feet long, painted with Egyptian images. "What's he holding?" Sadie whispered to me. "Is that a boomerang?" Sure enough, Dad raised his hand, and he was brandishing a curved, white stick. It did look like a boomerang, but instead of the throwing stick, he touched it to the Rosetta Stone. Sadie caught her breath. Dad was writing on the stone. Wherever the boomerang made contact, glowing blue lines appeared on granite. Hieroglyphs. It made no sense. How could he write glowing words with a stick? But the image was bright and clear. It was a ram's horn above a box and an X. "Open," Sadie murmured. I stared at her, because it sounded like she had just translated the word, but that was impossible. I'd been hanging out with Dad for years, and even I couldn't read many hieroglyphs. They were seriously hard to learn. Dad raised his arms. He chanted, "Wo-si-ai," and 2 more hieroglyphic symbols burned blue against the surface of the Rosetta Stone. As stunned as I was, I recognized the first symbol. It was the name of the Egyptian god of the dead. "Wo-seer," I whispered. I'd never heard it pronounced that way. I mean, the way I knew it was pronounced Osiris. "Osiris, come," Sadie said, as if in a trance. Then her eyes widened. "No!" she shouted. "Dad, no!" Our father turned in surprise. He started to say, "Children," but it was too late. The ground rumbled. The blue light turned to a searing white, and the Rosetta Stone exploded. When I finally regained consciousness, the first thing I heard was laughter. Horrible, gleeful laughter mixed with a blare of the museum's security alarms. I felt like I'd just been ran over by a tractor. I sat up, dazed, and spit a piece of the Rosetta Stone out of my mouth. The gallery was in ruins. Waves of fire rippled in pools along the floor. Giant statues had toppled. Sarcophagi had been knocked off their pedestals. Pieces of the Rosetta Stone had exploded outward with such force that they embedded themselves in the columns, the walls, other exhibits. Sadie was passed out next to me, but she looked unharmed. I took her by the shoulder, and she grunted with a great big ugh. In front of us, where the Rosetta Stone had been, stood a smoking, sheared-off pedestal. The floor was blackened in a starburst pattern, except for the glowing blue circle around our father. He was facing our direction, but he didn't seem to be looking at us. A bloody cut ran across his scalp. He gripped the boomerang tightly. I didn't understand what he was looking at. Then the horrible laughter echoed around the room again, and I realized that it was coming from right in front of me. Something stood between our father and us. At first I could barely make it out, just a flicker of heat, but as I concentrated, it took a vague form, the fiery outline of a man. He was taller than Dad, and his laugh cut through me like a chainsaw. "Well done," he said to my father. "Very well done, Julius." "You were not summoned." My father's voice trembled. He held up the boomerang, but the fiery man flicked one finger, and the stick flew out of my dad's hand, shattering against the wall. "I am never summoned, Julius," the man purred. "But when you open a door, you must be prepared for guests to walk through." "Back to Duat," my father roared. "I have the power of the great king." "Ooh, scary," the fiery man said with amusement. "And even if you knew how to use that power, which you do not, he was never my match. I am the strongest. Now you will share his fate." I couldn't make sense of anything, but I knew I had to help Dad. I tried to pick up the nearest chunk of stone. I was so terrified my fingers felt frozen and numb. My hands were useless. Dad shot me a silent look of warning. "Get out." I realized he was intentionally keeping the fiery man's back to us, hoping Sadie and I would escape unnoticed. Sadie was still groggy. I managed to drag her behind a column into the shadows. When she started to protest, I clamped my hand over her mouth. That woke her up. She saw what was happening and stopped fighting. Alarms blared. Fire circled around the doorways of the gallery. The guards had to be on their way, but I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad. Dad crouched to the floor, keeping his eyes on his enemy, and opened his painted wooden box. He brought out a small rod like a ruler. He muttered something under his breath, and the rod elongated into a great wooden staff that was as tall as he. Sadie made a squeaking sound. I couldn't believe my eyes either, but things only got weirder. Dad threw his staff at the fiery man's feet, and it changed into an enormous serpent, 10 feet long and as big around as I was, with coppery scales and glowing red eyes. It lunged at the fiery man, who effortlessly grabbed the serpent by its neck. The man's hand burst into white-hot flames, and the snake burnt to ashes. "An old trick, Julius," the fiery man chided. My dad glanced at us, silently urging us to run. Part of me refused to believe any of this was real. Maybe I was unconscious. Yeah, that's it. I'm still having a nightmare. Next to me, Sadie picked up a chunk of stone. "How many?" my dad asked quickly, trying to keep the fiery man's attention on him. "How many did I release?" "Why, all 5, said the fiery man, as if explaining something to a child. "You should know we're a package deal, Julius. Soon I'll release even more, and they'll be very grateful. I shall be named king again." "The demon days," my father said. "They'll stop you before it's too late." The fiery man laughed. "You think the house can stop me? Those old fools can't even stop arguing amongst themselves. Now let the story be told anew, and this time you shall never rise." The fiery man waved his hand. The blue circle at Dad's feet went dark. Dad grabbed for his toolbox, but it skittered across the floor. "Goodbye, Osiris," the fiery man said. With another flick of his hand, he conjured a glowing coffin around our dad. At first it was transparent, but as our father struggled and pounded on its sides, the coffin began more and more solid. A golden Egyptian sarcophagus inlaid with jewels. My dad caught our eyes one last time and mouthed the word "run" before the coffin sank into the floor, as if the ground had turned to water. "Dad!" I screamed. Sadie threw her stone, but it sailed harmlessly through the fiery man's head. He turned, and for one terrible moment his face appeared in flames. What I saw made no sense. It was as if someone had superimposed 2 different faces on top of one another. One almost human, with pale skin, cruel angular features, and glowing red eyes. The other, like an animal, with dark fur and sharp fangs. Worse than a dog or a wolf or a lion, some animal I had never seen before. Those red eyes stared at me, and I knew I was going to die. Behind me, heavy footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the great court. Voices barking orders. The security guards? The police? But they'd never get here in time. The fiery man lunged at us. A few inches from my face, something shoved him backwards. The air sparked with electricity. The amulet around my neck grew uncomfortably hot. The fiery man hissed, regarding me more carefully. "So, it's you." The building shook again. At the opposite end of the room, part of the wall exploded in a brilliant flash of light. 2 people stepped through the gap. The man and the girl we'd seen at the Needle, their robes swirling around them. Both of them held staffs. The fiery man snarled. He looked at me one last time and said, "Soon, boy." Then the entire room erupted in flames. A blast of heat sucked all the air out of my lungs, and I crumpled to the floor. The last thing I remember, the man with the forked beard and the girl in blue were standing over me. I heard the security guards running and shouting, getting closer. The girl crouched over me and drew a long, curved knife from her belt. "We must act quickly," she told the man. "Not yet," he said with some reluctance. His thick accent sounded French. "We must be sure before we destroy them." I closed my eyes and drifted into unconsciousness. Tune in next week for Chapter 3, Imprisoned with My Cat.